Okay, after the break that always takes longer than my timetable was thinking when I was doing. Apologies for that. Now we are going to continue with the special event from 3 colleagues that asked us to come as a normal participant sending the communication. And I told them also, Yazmin, I told them that no, that we should all listen to them. And that's what we are here today. So Carla, that is also an architect coming from Brazil, but now she lives in Barcelona, that she has been working on Linda Bobardi, is going to introduce them.
Hello. First, I would like to mention the work everyone is doing in this conference, the outstanding work Eva Alvarez conducting, and all the UPV team, Carlos Gomez is photographing here, opening the sessions, thinking, and the chairs, the speakers, the researchers, and also the support of CUG, the gender chair of architecture and urbanism in the university in Valencia, the Architectural Association, the Colegio de Arquitectos de Valencia, the IAWA, Lina Platform, Nuestras Arquitectas, and much more. I'm very, very glad to introduce this panel, this lecture conversation between 4 architects that, besides their inspiring work in architectural education and criticism, they develop a strong work on activism and pedagogic digital and non-digital curatorship, focusing on intersectional feminism. They work very, very actively in various organizations and journals committed to collective advocacy and cultural engagement. Susanne Ewing in the Journal of Architecture and Culture for the past 10 years. Justine Clark in Architecture Australia prior as a co-founder of Parallel, Gender Equity in Architecture. Laurie Brown, co-founder of Architects, Gender Equity in Architecture organization based in New York City. And Yazmin Crespo Claudio, co-founder of the Taller Creando Sin Encargos and engaged in Harvard Archive in intersectional international feminism. We will have first the presentation by Yazmin Crespo Claudio, and then a conversation, a lecture, and then a conversation between Susanne Ewing, Justine Clark, and Laurie Brown. So I'm very glad to have this hard work to present their CV, their background. I will be very, very concise in this task, because otherwise we will have a lecture here. Yazmin Crespo Claudio is professor and PhD in Harvard, PhD candidate at Harvard, and holds masters in Harvard, Cornell University, and Puerto Rico University. She taught in various universities as Ana Geméndez, New York Institute of Technology, Politécnica de Puerto Rico, Escuela Elisava de Barcelona, and she was the recipient of the Harvard Frederick Sheldon Fellowship and the Jorge Paulo Lehmann Fellowship and others. Susanne Ewing holds a chair of architectural criticism at the University of Edinburgh. Her publications, let me advance. This is the Yazmin work, and what I'm talking about. Her publications include architecture and fieldwork, spaces of tolerance, and others on transformative collective methods and architectural practices. Among the projects to augmenting the knowledge of women's contribution to architecture in Scotland, we can mention Voices of Experience Beautiful project, which most recent event is Assembling Women with Beauty Environment, Women Build Cities, etc., etc. Justine Clark is an architectural editor, a writer advocate. She is the honorary principal fellow at the University of Melbourne, Australia. In parallel, she will talk about the group that she co-leads is very, very active in public discussions, exhibitions, international jury, and so on. Her work was recognized with the Marion Mahoney Prize and the President's Prize from the Australian Institute of Architecture Victorian Chapter. And Laurie Brown is a distinguished professor at the School of Architecture at Syracuse University. Her influential books include Feminist Practice, Interdisciplinary Approach to Women in Architecture, Contested Spaces, Abortion Clinics, Women's Shelters and Hospital, the ongoing research that I am thrilled to know about birth centers, Borders and Bodies. And she's also an Architectural League of New York Emerging Voice recipient. Thank you all. And Yazmin, Crespo, Claudio, we are delighted to hear you.
Well, in the meantime, buenas tardes. Thank you, Eva, Carlos, ICAC, committees, faculty, and students. I am incredibly grateful. I apologize. There's an issue between PowerPoint and PDF. So there will be some things that you won't get to see because they're media, but I will share the PowerPoint with the school later, and then you can see the whole thing. So I was saying I am incredibly grateful and humbled by the opportunity to speak spatially about counterpedagogies, the colonial feminist practices in Puerto Rico, cuerpas, colectivas, and archives, moving from the footnote to the center of the page. Bare knuckle, like Gloria and Saldua's making face, is a metaphor for constructing one identity and fighting from combative scenarios. Boxing is a national sport and an intrinsic part of Puerto Rico's culture. It represents the existence and resistance of the Puerto Ricans, or the Boricuas. And I learned that as a teenager growing up in Caguas, Puerto Rico with my family, we watch all the fights, and with neighbors as well. Sports activity is the only instance in which Puerto Rico is recognized on equal terms with the rest of the nations in the world. This presentation, Bare Knuckle, or the sweet science of sparing speciality, sparing here refers to a form of training or teaching to counterpunch architecture that make use of rounds. The representation is organized in 3 rounds or asaltos. Round number 1 is wrapping, brings method to the madness to shadow boxing counterpedagogies. Round number 2 is training, display tactical principles, and square off the colonial practices. And number 3, sparing, delivers the necessary combinations and footwork, bodies, and colectivas. I would like to take a second to start by situating myself so that you have an idea of the position where I speak from. Following the footsteps of design scholars Dr. Luz Marie Rodriguez y Yaramaite Colón, I would like to say first, I'm Puertorriqueña. being a so-called Hispanic US citizen living in an unincorporated territory, a rewarding for Colonia. I inhabit one of the many borders drawn and uncontrolled by the United States. Also, I represent the current demographic statistics, which places 50% of the Puerto Ricans community and on the so-called mainland, and the other 50% on the minor land. Also, I have been teaching and practicing architecture and design for 23 years in or from the United States, Spain, and Puerto Rico. And in 2012, Omaira and I established Talleres Creando Sin Encargos, a colectiva working towards social spatial design for urban justice. We see ourselves as activist scholars, or in Spanish, we call ourselves rebeldes. We recognize that historically, architecture in Puerto Rico has been, and mostly still is, connected to the circuit of authority or privileged white men who designed and built an inhabitable viol inhospitable archipelago. Puerto Rico remains affected by an ongoing financial crisis that has shaken the island economically, socially, and politically since late 2005. This situation was made much worse on September of 2017 when the island was devastated by Hurricane Maria, an event that caused this crisis to become also a humanitarian one. Crises are sites. Puerto Rican crises include colonialism and coloniality, impoverishment, capitalism, modernization, and their derivatives. However, these are contexts that have been often unacknowledged or have not been interpreted for the perspective of architectural history, theory, criticism, and practice. In Puerto Rico, where crises intermingle, most scholars have opted to remain silent about the historical crises that have driven planning, public policy, architecture, engineering, and design. Opposing the silences through collective research and public scholarship, Taller Creando Sin Encargos and others like Taller Gráfico PR have started to problematize crises and how they affect the multiple dimensions, conditions, products, uses, and meanings of design and architecture, as well as the strategies devised to tackle or contest them. For example, in the center, you read La Isla del Encanto. By separating en from canto, instead of reading Island of Enchantment, read Island in pieces or fragments. This art was created after Hurricane Maria and also the earthquakes that followed in 2019 and 2020. We can find also Isla Cráter, of Isla Carbón, Puerto Rico Herido, and all more illustrating environmental, social, economic, political, and cultural struggles and insecurities. The wave in. The boxing wave in is just as big as the fight itself. What is bare knuckle? How do you brega, o bregar, against what? When and how did Puerto Rican begin to bregar? Ask Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones in his book of essays, The Art of Bregar. He explains that the verb bregar floats and winds in the multiple scenarios of Puerto Rican life from the island to the diaspora. Puerto Ricans are always en la brega, vulnerable and alert. Bregar is, you could say, another knowledge, a method to navigate everyday life where everything is precarious, changing, or violent, as it has been in the 20th century, and I will add also the 21st. And from that other knowledge, bare knuckle, in Spanish is a puño limpio, is a way of fighting combative scenarios. Boxing is called the sweet science because it is a sport that requires the pugilist to be tough, forward, thinking, and tactical. It's also about questions and answers. Sparring also refers to a form of training. Bare knuckles promotes the fight for equity in all settings. More than anything, it serves as a metaphor for opposition, a fight between two bodies that represent opposing ideas and values. So be the first. throw your punches before your opponent. It was the first autonomous feminist organization of the second period of feminism in Puerto Rico between 1972 and 1979 that the women who formed the organization Mujer Intégrate Ahora met first under the name of Puerto Ricans Women's Committee, responding to the call made by Nilda Ponte among those attending the public hearings of the Civil Rights Commission. On January 8th of 1972, they formally established the organization and called it MIA, o Mujer Intégrate Now, Ahora, agreeing on its purpose and objectives and a regulation for membership. Some of the 1977 May 1st slogans that you can see here say, Puerto Rican woman, you own your body. If you want to have rights, you must believe in the fight. Women-led marches are nothing new in Puerto Rico. In fact, women have always been at the center of the movements that created lasting change on the island. These days, young women are delving into history and rescuing the work of feminists such as Luisa Capetillo, a 19th century suffragist who organized workers and who was arrested for wearing pants at the turn of the last century, Juana Colom, a Black suffragist and working class heroine, feminist poet Julia de Burgos, who in the 1940s wrote about the condition of women, and Lolita Lebron, who along with three men, shot up the Blair House in Washington, D.C. in 1954 to protest Puerto Rico's lack of independence. Reclaiming their feminist lineage is more than a history lesson for women today. It's a decolonization process that has also helped them reclaim their indigenous and African identities as the two groups also battle their invisibility in the larger Puerto Rican history. Unlike feminist movements in other parts of the world, in this archipelago, this charge is horizontal and massive and has no leader. Rapping brings method to the madness of shadowboxing counter-pedagogies. So, round number one. So, why are counter-pedagogies important? Shadowboxing is one of the oldest and all-around exercise proof for improving many aspects of your fight. There is an emphasis on the boxer's body. To confront architecture is to hacer frente the processes of education, planning, and construction of how we live and how we are regulated and segregated. Radical pedagogies must fight against the invisibility of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. These pedagogies must address the problems that arise through class struggle, impoverishment, and precariousness to which marginalized communities are subjected. Opposing anywhere has a lot to do with surviving and starting over. Pedagogy is political, and we must assume the first line of defense of the archipelago, steering the imagination and the possible. El taller Creando Sin Encargos, or I guess the translation would be Creating Without Commissions, is a collective or colectiva based in Cambridge and San Juan, Puerto Rico, working on design, research, and academic activism since 2012. Our methodology is horizontal, and we're interested in the social aspects of architecture and design from an intersectional, decolonial, and critical perspective. We intend to analyze experiences together with spaces, images, and objects. At the 13th Sao Paulo International Architecture Biennale, we present the processes and results of the workshop Arquitecturas Colectivas that we did in La Perla in 2013, Puerta de Tierra in 2017, and Barrio Obrero San Ciprián in 2021. Co-design and construction projects in public spaces were developed in these workshops, supporting existing communities' initiatives. This is carried out in collaborations with children, youth, leaders of the communities, designers, volunteers. The purpose of the workshops is to organize spaces for equity where all voices are considered. That is why the classroom is a research, horizontal space, and a learning community. I don't see the classroom as something separate from other social work. I am an academic activist concerned with the revolutionary imagination. The classroom and our design studio should be connected with spaces of exclusion and historically subaltern, silenced, and marginalized group, from sightseeing landscapes of disillusionment to other ways of doing architecture around the Lower East Side in New York. Round number 2. Training displays tactical principles and square off the colonial practices. The fighting sense of the term square off, o cuadrado, comes from a head-on square stance, which allows for more power behind our offensive hits. What does a colonial practice imply in Puerto Rico? Spaces are not neutral. They teach us and build us, creating theories and proposing a practice from the feminist perspective of architectural design and urban planning implies a decolonial positioning. Knowledge must be situated in communities and intersectional experiences and initiatives in an inclusive and multidisciplinary pedagogy. Reoccupy, rewrite, unlearn, and deaccelerate excessive growth are some guides that shape a new approach, are based on slow and detailed observation. The exchange of knowledge, respect for natural resources, situated knowledges, breaking with social construction and space associated with gender, ethnicity, class, or sexual orientation, all are visions opposed to a patriarchal society that makes women's holistic perspectives visible. Thus, projecting counter-narratives of architectural pedagogy insist on a local scaffolding that objects to the Eurocentric global vision and affirms the visibility and use of space. It can arise from traditions, participatory process, and the body in movement. A critical exercise that projects the hierarchization that Arturo Escobar writes about in his book, Autonomy and Design, the realization of the communal, to ask about the role of the academy in the new visions of design, and of course, to propose the hierarchization and the elitization of knowledge. For example, like the Taller Creando Sin Encargos, other organizations such as La Maraña, founded in 2014, use participatory action research and co-creation methodologies in self-managed spaces and with Puerto Rican communities. In particular, the Post-Maria Imagination Project in the Mariana neighborhood of Humacao addressed the immediate need for drinking water after Hurricane Maria in 2017. Like the fighter who attempts to overwhelm the spectator by applying constant pressure, the work is taking visible space and time. Sparing delivers the necessary combinations and footworks bodies colectivas. Boxing footwork is one of the most important aspects of boxing. It allows you to move towards your target and to get away. A game of inches, cuerpos y cuerpas are always moving. The practice contains a specific level of performance and interpreting of space, that which is physical and experiential. It is a kind of sidestep improvisation or pattern upon space, a sparing of spatiality. For Noemí Segarra, a movement artist from Puerto Rico, urgent dances become a critical stance. El transeúnte, or pedestrian, redefines the act of protestar. La calle, la plaza, la acera, public space is an important platform for the struggle. Cuerpas as archives, or bodies are as archives. Bodies are compilations of things and stories. In No Archive Will Restore You, Julieta Singh reconstructs lived space and lived narrative, her corporealities, crossing between perceive, conceive, and survive. Her body archive thus incorporates inhabited tangible sites and affects, a remix. Though the performing of fragmented matters of the body, La Cole, which you see here with Todas PR, two feminist organizations from Puerto Rico, accumulates a dense inventory of visible and invisible traces. Memories record the embodiment of crisis, inscribing and incorporating the past. A struggle based on a long, Black, radical, feminist tradition and of references such as the Combahee River Collective, founded in 1977, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lord Parties with I Have Puerto Rico in My Heart, Los Macheteros with Boricua Popular Army, Long Live Free Puerto Rico, and of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. But how is memory different than historical documents? What is the presence and absence of materials and places? The archives has expansive meanings, and it's also your enabling fictions. It can be both a reminder and a residue situated as atravesado or pierce in bodily narratives. So I want to introduce you guys to About In, or Archive in International Intersectional Feminism, 2013. The first edition produced for Women's Day of this year, March 8th. The Colectiva members are Natalia Dopaso, former Law Fellow and co-founder of Ciudad del Deseo in Buenos Aires. GSD students Hawan Ma and also Gabriela Enid Davila Rivera, and myself. We assemble various initiatives that explore how space can engage different understandings of race, gender, and class in the global South. So Archiving In has many parts. It has Action to Read, plus En Ronda, and together they bring together a multidisciplinary and international group of researchers, practitioners, and students whose interest spans a wide range of issues that emerge around feminism. These concerns encompass multiple design fields and spatial disciplines. They take the form of text, video, recordings, dialogue, and print. Archive in the form happen mainly in the form of the acquisition of text by underrepresented voices in the Frances Loeb Library at Harvard GSD, over 100 resources. Action to Read was in the form of a video, reading as a form of resistance, to listen to collaboratory and intersectional practices and pedagogies from feminist voices. So for this one in particular, we were asking feminists to join us to record a video of a 1-minute video, but to read not from their work, but to read from other person's work, so we could continue multiplying voices. These displays of text and the video of feminist voices was at the Frances Loeb Library, exhibited there as well. And on March 8th, we also have En Ronda, which was a conversation to share experiences, struggles, and thoughts with faculty and guests. So not a panel, not a lecture, which is what I'm doing right now. It was just an open space at the library. It's important for me to underscore that this is a library space. It's a space where they have the special collections, they have the general collections, and it's open to the public as well. So a wide range of selection materials, as I was saying, from the archive were displayed, revolving around these topics about feminism. They included drawings, photographs, sketches. They also have poems. And in the event of the Archives Party, I would like to explain that it was a smaller group of people. And we obviously work with the material that is at the special collections of the Frances Loeb Library. And we try to explore and multiply the scales of design, but we also try to emphasize the designers' contributions in other areas such as journalism and activism. As you can imagine, most of the researchers who visit the collection are looking at the work of modern architecture and male architects. This action, the one that we created, is kind of a counterpunch to a space that should promote equity and identify, locate, and acquire resources also by female architects. Archives are spaces of gaps and silences. These are the events, actions, and individuals that were never formally recorded or attributed. Those who are often overlooked include individuals from other groups that have become marginalized. This exhibition positions itself at these margins and considers the gender work that falls on the shoulders of women, domestic, physical, emotional, and otherwise. We hope to highlight the importance of collecting and retaining knowledge that has either traditionally been cast aside or not privileged, and the types of action this can lead to. We were inspired by archivists Anne Gilligan and Michelle Caswell, who developed the idea of an impossible archival imaginary. According to Gilligan and Caswell, collections of objects, even those that cannot physically exist because the objects have been lost, are inaccessible, or might not have ever existed to begin with, take on the power that transcends themselves within the social imaginary and inspire collective action. Education must provide the tools to create alternative models of practice and create new spaces for action and structures of emancipation. Help students to develop and improve their critical thinking skills, teaching them to ask critical questions to find alternative answers. That is, from indignation and also care, from an ecology of knowledge and abandoning normative approaches that seeks to resolve predetermined typologies or programs in the way designing of being in the world, perhaps in contrast to the architectural object. Following Gloria Anzaldua's footsteps, we need to make theories that point out ways to maneuver between our experiences and the need to form our own categories and theoretical models. En las cuerdas, en el ring, en la academia, y en la calle, to the students, always books over bombs. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think this is the point to have huge thank to everyone here, particularly Eva. You've indulged us with your call for this amazing conference, and we saw it as an opportunity to have a conversation amongst ourselves, and now here we're having a bigger conversation. But thank you so much for making everything possible and all the work behind the scenes. We really appreciate that. Yeah. We can say that again later as well. And Carla, thank you for such a lovely and thoughtful introduction that's really set the scene. We are going to, the three of us, seeing our individual names, I think it's really important to understand that we are here because of organizational and collaborative work we do. We are going to have a very short introduction to each of our organizations before we have a conversation amongst ourselves, which is loosely structured around questions which we had in relation to the conference theme. And the images behind us are going to scroll through and they're going to punctuate the questions. So it's a loose structure. Yeah. And we really want to have a wider conversation at the end. So we hope that we offer something that can be interesting, useful, thoughtful for either conversation in this time before lunch or beyond in the conference. Okay, over to Laurie.
Okay. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to Architects organization I co-founded, which was a direct result of the first book I had published, Feminist Practices. Through a series of book talks in New York City, it became very apparent that there was a lack between institutions and those practicing, those students and those educators. So Architects builds upon an intellectual feminist framework to create gender equity in architecture. Integral to our mission is richly diverse outreach and educational programming that focus on both the profession and the academy. We really see ourselves as a bridge between these two realms. And we're interested in creating exposure and offering mentoring for all those who identify as women in New York City, as well as those beyond. So over the past 10 plus years, we've held a variety of types of endeavors with over 200 regularly scheduled events, These include such things as brown bag lecture series, monthly happy hours, mentorship meetings, monthly writing and reading groups, publications in our online journal Subtext, a high school program that was run through New York University, workshops and lectures, as well as exhibitions. And our blog has published more than 60 topics of conversations and debate. So I want to highlight a few of those very quickly. The first is our WikiD efforts. It was initially inspired by Despina Stratokakis' Places essay. If you haven't read it, you should. Unforgetting Women Architects from the Pritzker to Wikipedia, published in 2013. And through that, we recognized that there was a great need to change the online record of women architects, including in Wikipedia. And this is not just online, but clearly everywhere, as so many of you have been talking about over this conference. So we launched it on International Women's Day in 2015. And this ongoing project's global effort writes more women into the most used resource in the world. And in collaboration with Parler and Germany's Nails, we included and expanded these efforts, which were supported by the Wikimedia Foundation. And following this first call in 2015, our organizations had collaborated in hosting writing workshops in Berlin, Melbourne, and New York, somewhat simultaneously over a series of months. We developed guidelines that Justine may mention later in 2015. And the global project continues. And to date, we have worked with over 302 writers to create 372 articles, edit 943 other existing articles, and added more than 500,000 words on women in Wikipedia to date. So we have also curated 2 exhibitions. The first that you're seeing here is Private Choices Public Spaces, which was a design action for what was then the last abortion clinic that was in Mississippi, which is now illegal to have abortions in Mississippi. And we were asking the public to talk about what is the role design can play in such contested spaces. And the second exhibition that you see here, Now What? Advocacy, Activism, and Alliances in American Architecture in 1968, is an interactive and online catalog that will culminate in a publication where we tell the largely unknown history of architects and designers who advanced the values of equality and social justice, especially those for the civil rights, feminist, LGBTQ movements of the last half century. This has traveled to over 13 venues, is currently at the Boston Society for Architecture. It's been up for the last year. And as it moved, we brought in material from each venue. So local additions were made based on expertise on the ground. So we see this as an archive always and forever in the making and will never be complete.
Thank you. Voices of Experience started in 2016 as a conversation in a park. The Professional Institute of Architects in Scotland was just celebrating 100 years, and we were quite shocked that only 1 woman appeared in publicity and chronologies. So myself and Jude Barber, who had that conversation, talked about women, and we knew who had taught us, who we worked with. We realized that many were still around, and we wanted to find out more. And in our day jobs, we knew many younger women. So what would an alternative architectural origin story be for us? And to avoid getting trapped in images, we set out to listen. We facilitated loosely structured conversations in a site or with a thematic area that both participants have in common. And so you can see shots of them here. Approaching older, often retired women we knew, we set up times and places to meet. The conversations are audio recorded. And we've developed bespoke protocols for augmented, full verbatim transcriptions that are being assembled on an open access data share platform. The situation of voices and all their tenor, it seems really important. This work we've taken opportunities to participate in events, such as with Glasgow Women's Library, and with Archifringe, which is a grassroots platform for architectural activity in Scotland, which also was initiated about that 2016 time. And audiences, we found, have loved meeting in person over tea and cake, fascinated by women's working lives. Architectural work is changing over a long life. It's a process, it's collaborative. And we're finding we're revealing insights of everyday practice, ordinary working lives. For the Mementos exhibition in Glasgow in 2019, we asked older participants to select an object that represented their working lives. And that's the sort of part of it here. There was a really interesting range. And I just wanted to mention Karen Burns, who's both Laurie and Justine work very closely, who's very kindly helped us to see our work as a kind of remembering in public. And more recently, we've been commissioned to work with creative producers and cultural institutions in Scotland to assemble some of our conversation extracts alongside work by artists, writers, and historians. Our work is small scale. Scotland's a small country. It's slow burn, it's quiet, and it's ongoing. We aim to influence an argument and augment architectural culture in Scotland. We need to keep listening, and we need to learn as we go. And I just want to end with Bell Hook's amazing comment on conversation. Genuine conversation is the sharing of power and knowledge. It is fundamentally a cooperative enterprise. It not only makes room for every voice, it also presupposes that all voices can be heard.
Thank you.
one that is critical and in need of significant intervention because, and precisely because of the organizing and advocacy and activism that we're all involved in. So we came to this idea of the archive, as we've mentioned, accidentally, and what we're calling the accidental archivism. None of us began with the idea of needing to intervene in the archive, and yet that is precisely what all of us are doing. So the first kind of series of questions that we were wanting to talk about are, how did the tactics of mobilization deployed by our organizations scale, and how does activism impact the archive? What is the potential of open networks, digital crowdsourcing, and dynamic systems to open up new possibilities of archiving the work of women and creating collaborative productions of knowledge? So I'm happy because I have a microphone to start. But I think with architects, you know, I think as so many people have acknowledged and said, there's often a dearth of representation. And so we realize both within the academy and practice, we have to create platforms for more women's voices and work to be made evident. And we saw the WikiD project as a really great example or idea that has become an example of how, you know, we can train new writers who intervene in Wikipedia that then can hopefully intervene in bibliographies and teaching, and it just becomes like this growing effort. And I think, at least I will say, we're committed to doing this work until Wikipedia, you know, has equity of representation. So for us, this intervening became, you know, it immediately started as action, but we're now seeing it and having many different facets of addition, like content from this conference, like all these platforms that you're all engaged in need to cycle through Wikipedia. And I want to acknowledge, Wikipedia is not a scholarly resource, but it is a resource that everyone at some point goes to and checks and cross-checks. And we need scholars, we need experts intervening in that space also to make it better and more robust.
Okay, just sort of in the Scottish context, I think one of the things in our sort of journey of the last sort of 7 years or so has been understanding that even in a small country, archive is not a singular thing. And I talked about the Professional Institute. That has a chaotic archive. It's not systematic. There was a project which looked at professional architectural papers that situated a lot of Scottish architects and buildings in a very conventional, canonical way that has been an amazing work. And actually, we see it as a site to actually add to and augment. You know, the work has been done to set it up with some infrastructure, it got funding, and, you know, adding to that seems one of the right things to do. But we're also aware that, you know, in a small place, the hierarchies of who holds the knowledge, who has gate-keeping powers, is really important. And that's not always what's in the archive, but it's what comes through the architectural culture of who's invited to speak, as you mentioned, Justine, and also the manner that you set things up. So that grey sort of cultural transferring of knowledge, which came up in the earlier section this morning, is so important. So we feel, I think, we've been trying to understand what archive means. And the Glasgow Women's Library, I just want to massive shout out. And you saw Adele Patrick, who's the creative director, holding up Kate Eichhorn's book, has been fantastic. They are an accredited museum of women's work, and the only one in the UK. And they've been so supportive and so interesting in contextualizing a lot of what we came from, quite a narrow position within architecture and making, to think much more broadly. So they work with creative practice, and they've opened our eyes to lots of things. So I think the scaling can be moving into different modes. Just
yeah, no, I think I absolutely agree, and I have to say our experience with WikiD, which was just remarkable. I mean, when Laurie got in touch, I mean, we'd read Despina's article, and I remember thinking, oh, we need to do something, and Laurie got in touch going, fellow feminists, we need to do something, and we were like, yes, we don't really have time, but we'll have a go. And we quickly learned it's this sort of weirdo parallel universe that you have to learn how to navigate. But I think there were 4 or 6 Australian women in women in architecture in Wikipedia at that time. Now, if you go to the list, there's many more women than men. So it's like this parallel universe of Australian architecture because nobody's actively putting the men in there at the moment. So that's really fascinating. I mean, I guess I was trying to think about this question in relation to what have we learned about how to make change and how might that be applied to thinking about, contributing to archives, using archives, kind of engaging with the archive. And I think there's 2 really core things. Firstly, you have to make people welcome. And secondly, you have to make it easy for them to participate. You have to make it easy for people to say yes. And that takes a lot of work for the person setting it up. It's not, setting up a really simple framework is actually very time consuming. But once you've got it, then things can happen. So it's about providing really clear, simple and inviting frameworks. It's about building trust. It's about people feeling like they may belong in this place. And I think that seems very relevant to the archive, where I think a lot of people don't see themselves. And I know, there's, of course I can't remember who said this, but there's this very nice quote about, men have archives and women have memories. And so how do we get, it's a cliche, but how do we get those memories into the archive? And I think for the first thing you have to do is you have to make people welcome. The archive, I think for many practitioners, for people who aren't scholars, the archive is a strange and distant place. It's not a place they see themselves. So you have to build trust. You have to tell compelling narratives about why it matters, and you have to demonstrate a need. And I thought that the 1 by 1 project that Paola talked about the other night was a perfect example of this. A really simple format, a really lovely invitation. Something you can do. It's not hard to do, to put that together, but it's, again, a lot of thought and care into crafting that. And then you've got, I guess, what's in Wikipedia would be called a sub. It's just this very short, small entry, but it's a sort of cracking open the door. And some of those people may only ever exist in that one small thing, and other people may become, much more extensive things. But I also think, I guess the other thing I'd want to say is about the value of the everyday. I think we're all really interested in people's everyday experiences. I have to say, having been the editor of Architecture Australia for a long time, I'm much less interested in buildings now. I'm interested in, in the kind of experiences of workplaces and working lives, and I'm sort of we're interested in making change at that level. But yeah. I think we can our timing hasn't got to the end of this question, so we can talk to each other some more, because it's not just a panel, it's a conversation.
Absolutely. There was something I was going to...
Or have we gone past? We haven't. No, look at our timing, it's perfect. Oh, it's me, okay. Okay, so as I said, I'm really interested in conversation as a mode of practice and of knowledge creation. I'm also interested, I think, really in the overlaps and gaps between our 3 organisations. I mean, we've been in touch, we started at very similar times, we've been in touch on and off in all sorts of ways over the years. We have colleagues that we share, but we do quite different things. And I think we're all interested in action. So how do we help ensure that this action-oriented work that we're all involved with in some way makes its way into the existing archives? So we might be building our own archives, but how do we get into the kind of more institutional archives? And I know, Susanne, you've sort of found yourself being archived accidentally as well as intentionally. And how do we learn from those experiences to quite intentionally embed traces of action within archives?
I mean, just one observation, because I think, you did that lovely introduction to Framus, Laurie, as well. And I think I'm very conscious that we work quite consciously between academia and practice. And there's a freedom in that being a different space. And I think we were sort of quite excited when we started. We just, let's do it. We don't have to ask permission. We don't have to actually tick a box. We don't have to make sure it fits into our deliverables and job descriptions, either in the commercial world of time is precious and, moving money and managing resources, or in the kind of, hugely sort of bureaucratic, kind of demands of, current higher education, which is, so there was a freedom about being between those two that I think offering an invitation into that space has been really liberating. And I think Jude and myself particularly have felt very liberated by that. It's almost like we step into another environment. And I think we've become more conscious that when we didn't intend to set up lots of events, but actually when we started having tea and cake in the women's library and we had a 90-year-olds coming in and we had to think about how they sat in the space, how they heard, how everyone felt comfortable, what was too long, what was too short. It became a kind of a very positive thing. And we suddenly became aware we were making space in the way for things to happen that we might not have preconceived.
I think one of the things we've thought a lot about, and also in the encyclopedia, which is this other thing, but is how do we understand or how do we frame worth and who is worthy of inclusion. That's definitely a thing that we talk about with Wikipedia, and that's why we generated a whole new set of guidelines. And so what are those categories of inclusion? How do we expand those? And I think intervening both intentionally and unintentionally in archives requires us to think about and be more strategic of how do we frame contributions and significance, and how is that, what are the merits of that, those contributions? We thought it was very odd in Wikipedia, for example, that you have to have it has to have 3 citations. That's Wikipedia's requirement, or it will immediately get deleted. And so, as we know, when women who are part of teams aren't listed and there's no immediate evident trace, that means that person did not contribute, which as I've heard through different conversations here, sometimes you find them in the weirdest places. So I think understanding and thinking more critically about how archives frame who they want to include and helping work with them to expand that is something we definitely, both in architects and elsewhere, we've had to contend with and really fight against to create more inclusion and more inclusionary tactics.
And the Wikipedia criteria for notability for architecture are derived from the notability criteria for art. And we might say art is also a collective practice, but the production of buildings is a much larger collective practice than, so it's also about, I think we had some plan to tackle the notability criteria, but I don't think we've done that yet. Have you done that?
I had a question, Justine, for Parlour, because I suppose one thing that we've noticed with some of our very few, older participants, they start to suddenly get re-energized about wanting to change their own record, so they add to or, sort of wonder about telling their story differently or beginning to think about how they are represented. I just wondered if there was anything you've had from people who've taken part in events and whether that's been, people have been reframing.
I think so a little bit. We inspired by you would like to do a big oral history project. With Julie Willis, who, people have spoken about quite a lot today, in relation to those women who are getting quite older. Because a lot of the salons that we run are very much aimed at intergenerational conversations, but we don't have that many people who are in that sort of older cohort. I was very interested in your kind of conversation about institutional framing too. So we began through a big institutional grant. Naomi got lots of money. And then we were this kind of, so we had that institutional status which let us get a very long way. And then, but Parlour itself was always, it had no sort of status until we became an incorporated association. And then, we're very opportunistic, Naomi and I particularly, but I think all of us really, we see something and we kind of go for it, and we see, so the pandemic hit and we set up a bazillion online events, which have just become this huge flourishing thing, which probably we wouldn't have done had the pandemic not happened. But yeah, so we went from that institutional context into a very fluid thing, and now we've sort of made our own institution. I mean, I was joking to my partner that I don't like institutions, and he was like, yeah, you've made your own. So I guess now, yeah, I don't quite know where I'm going with that. I'll hand over to you.
I was just going to say Architects was completely against institutions.
Yes.
We didn't want to be affiliated, associated with any of them because we felt like they all were awful. I mean, in the US, they're not helping women as much as they should, even if there's a women in architecture subpart. So we saw ourselves as really working in defiance to the kind of inherent structures. And that's not to say you shouldn't work within institutions, but we just saw ourselves as just not wanting at all to be associated. So we also became a nonprofit in 2015, and that enabled us to apply for government funding. So that's, I mean, we were talking about this, like we have no money, it's volunteer effort, we work on a shoestring. So it's always a bit of a fight of resources. We're resource poor, but volunteer rich. So I think that's another piece to this is how do we do these things that we can't afford to pay anyone. So that's a challenge.
I mean, so you mentioned worth. I mean, we're very similar, you know, sort of work, but also I think to recognize the privilege, you know, so having a tenured role, you know, some access to research funding, knowledge exchange, you know, bits and pieces that you can patch together, you know, is a strategy to sort of help support. I mean, likewise, Jude in practice, you know, because, you know, she's got a role where she can enable that and there's the connections. I think we want to acknowledge that, but it is a hand to mouth. I think that maybe gives you a certain having to live by your wits a bit, but it is problematic in this. It does raise these questions about when do you become systematic
so I need to
and
fess
structural.
up here. We do have money. I go and raise it, and we pay people, including me. I don't have a full-time job, and so Parlour would not exist if we didn't fund it. And we fund it because, I mean, it could exist in some much. Sorry, I'm just going to keep the slide over here.
We need to move on.
In a much smaller way. But I think we are constantly arguing that people should be paid for their time, so we also think we should be paid for our time. But so it's a slightly different model. We get funding from institutions, but we get funding from lots of them, so we're not beholden to any of them. So, I mean, we don't align with any of them. But
right,
we align
our
with
third
all
phase of questions, because we realised when we kind of put this together across Zoom, again, there's a digital context for this, that we were having too much in this bit of thinking that we haven't been able to unpack. But our third aspect, I suppose, was what are the implications for us of beginning to think of this, the archive as a place of active practice? And how does the public engagement that we've all mentioned and we're all actively, whether that means an event or a guide or a publication or some other form of moving about in the world, how does it affirm, assert or open up archival practices or meet other archival practices, amazing sort of activist archival practices going on? And how does that interest with existing archives work? So I suppose it's primarily thinking, you know, we often think the archive is it's passive work. Things are predetermined. You know, there's a collecting, cataloguing, maintaining, updating. What happens when we sort of think about that more actively? And, you know, I know that, you know, the Now What exhibition, you know, is archived. This amazing, you know, kind of story of activism in the States. Parlour, you know, as part of all that's on the website, which is just such a treasure. I mean, Jill and others have written about archives data visibility. You know, there's a kind of looking at what you're doing as you go along that I think we all share. And I just wondered if any thoughts from you guys on that.
I mean, one thing our planning conversations in this conference has made me think about a lot, as well as some of the other work I'm involved in, is like we have to create other mechanisms of archiving. So I guess I'm a little bit, and I don't know if I'm an outlier, but I'm less committed to the archives that are the prestigious ones, because thinking about the Now What exhibition, for example, like some of this material does not exist in archives. And it's only because we have been able to meet with people and part of its oral histories that we have it. And so then the question becomes, well, what do we do with it and where does it go? So then it kind of comes full circle about, well, then do you deposit it in these more formal structures? So I'm fighting, there's an internal fight with myself because I understand like we need to create information that's accessible to the greatest degree possible. But those structures have not been so kind or so welcoming to the kind of content that we're creating, that we're interested in and think it's important, and the public thinks it's important too. So I think, you know, the archive as active practice is leading me to think more broadly and hopefully intervening more systematically in existing archives and maybe creating other spaces where these archives can live as well. I don't know yet what to do, but it raises for me really important questions internally about you know, these gatekeepers. I don't like the keepers. I want it to have much more, say, participatory engagement and voices involved.
I mean, my experience, and look, I think we're just building our own, and I mean, we document everything, and one of the nice things about having funding is we have, you know, we can make sure everything's properly photographed. We have a really great video editor who can edit our recordings. You know, we kind of really try to do, we work with institutions like Melbourne Uni who put money into things. So we really do try to document what we do. But I think, because again, I'm aware that all this work went on before us and it's not documented. It's hard to find. It's under someone's bed. The problem is at the moment it's, you know, I do worry, you know, it's in the cloud, it's in the website. God knows how, you know, as I said, our website is archived by the National Library, but, you know, it's kind of, it's a bit touch and go. So this has also started, you know, made me think about what do we do with all the stuff we've got lying around, like both digitally and you know, non-physically. So we're focused, I guess, on building our own depositories, and we've got quite extraordinary resources. Like we run our events, we run CPD, continuing professional development with that, and everyone who submits a form can tick a box saying that these answers can be available for, you know, parlour research, or they cannot tick that box. But we've just got this massive kind of resource of what people think about different topics, particularly in relation to really key questions about indigenising the built environment, which are really huge in Australia at the moment. So we've got this sort of resource. I don't know what we're doing with it. I guess the other thing I'd say that in my experience, and this is maybe a kind of lucky experience, the archives are interested. The sort of librarians and archivists that I know are sophisticated thinkers. They're very aware of the bias and the challenges of the worlds they work in. I think the question for us is, where do you put the stuff? Like, there's very few architecture archives in Australia. There's one in South Australia. They only collect material from that state. The Design Archive in Melbourne only collects material from that state. So it's not so much a way of kind of elbowing one's way in, but there even being a repository. That's kind of... yeah, but you're the queen of the archive.
I'm not the queen of the archive. But we ran some of the photos you've seen up here were, again, just to cite Glasgow Women's Library, because I think they're actually really interesting. So they are, the co-founders came from an art practice background and some quite activist feminist work, including Take Root in the 1980s, early 90s. They were provoked by a sort of moment in Glasgow's story being macho, etc., etc. And I think what you see from those, you might see it in some of the images, that they value the ephemeral artifact. And various people have looked at that. So there's something about the ephemeral artifact that's really important. They have very clear policy acquisitions. They work it through. It's all very rigorous. But they actually are based in a building in quite a mixed area of Glasgow. And they take on a very, very active role in working with the community. There's a lot of mixed heritage, lots of incomers, lots of sort of second generation immigrancy, and I think that has been really revelatory to make us again reflect back as to how unmixed we are in terms of the who we actually have in our ecologies of practice, and therefore the tools we have to act, because, I think some of these groups, a lot of them are reading groups. A lot of them are about, working around models of memories of housing in different places. And so there's this really other ways to actually see into quite important sort of anchoring. Someone mentioned anchoring earlier. I thought that was lovely in the earlier session, anchoring the knowledge. So I suppose it's just a checking a bit. But also, we ran an event which was searching, reading, listening. We were really interested in how you encounter the archive in an invited and open way, how you move around it. And, there's a sort of, engaging in any research, any finding, leaves lots of questions.
And
do you want to add anything else before?
no, I think open it up. We'd love to hear from all of you. Please.
Thank you, and thank you for your insights. It's amazing. You three have talked about allowing participation, making space for people, and you've talked about your organizations being voluntary, reliant on volunteers and volunteering work. But you haven't talked about belonging, and I wonder. I know Parlor creates a sense of belonging in the people that participate in the activities and the content creation. And I wonder if you three would want to talk about the sense of belonging that you create with your organizations. Thank you.
I suppose one of the things I love our project in the sense that one of the absolute joys is that we have got relationships built with all these amazing older women that, I've got older relatives, but I don't hang out with them in the same way. And that has been a complete delight. And actually one of the things that's been really interesting is that they've said that they've learned more from the younger, the connections, they're energized by that. So for me, the belonging is a kind of just a really extraordinary intergenerational, which I hate that word, but it's something about different ages and different experiences therefore are respected. Because if you're 90, and you've had a life, Anne Duff, who was in one of those images, she was involved in Cumbernauld Newtown. She worked in America for 10 years. She was she set up taught. She's worked in practice. She's done an awful lot of things in her one life. So I think there's something about feeling the horizons of your own working life are enhanced. So for me, the belonging side of it is something about shared experience. I think that's it.
And for us, we got created because people felt they didn't belong elsewhere. So it was really driven by the need to create a space for a wide range of experiences and ages. It was a direct response to that. When I was doing these book talks, and I was floored about the kind of conversations that were coming out. And so I literally collected people's emails and said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll email you, because clearly these conversations need to continue. And that's what led to a year of conversations that led to the founding of the organization. So we are inherently created to create space for those who didn't have it elsewhere. And I think, it ebbs and flows for sure. It's really, our initiatives are really led by people who have interest in doing something. It's non-hierarchical. And so it's really what is made by the people who are interested in doing things. So I think inherently at its core, it's about creating a space for those who want to be there and take action and do things.
I actually have no idea how we've done it. But I do often have people, and especially in the early days, say, they didn't feel comfortable or they didn't feel they had a place within the conventional institutions of architecture, and that they felt that they had a place in Parlour. And I guess that makes me very happy. I actually don't know how we've done it. I don't think, but I just think we're interested and we're curious, and we're not interested in really uninterested in policing disciplinary boundaries. I couldn't care less if you're a registered architect or not. A lot of people could in other institutions. And I think we also, I was thinking before, something you said made me think we kind of run this we walk this quite odd tightrope between being, like, I'm a really serious editor and I'm quite an interventionist editor, as some people will tell you. We take our graphics really seriously, we set things up really properly, we try to do things very well. But we also make these platforms in which people can do whatever that they like within, without getting us sued. So, our Instagram account, every week we have a different guest host and there's no rules. It's like, you can have this account for a week, it's got 24,000 followers, do what you want with it, so long as you don't get us sued. And like maybe once every 6 months I've got to kind of intervene in something that's going a bit awry. But it's very, people, I think you make a space, it's welcoming, it's kind, and people on the whole, I think, respect that. And it's like the salons, those conversations I was talking about, there's no brief. Like, it's like, come along, have a conversation as if nobody's watching you. Just pretend you're in the pub and have a chat. And they go all over the place. We did a wonderful one with Susanne. Every conversation is different, and so they keep going. Like, no one is bored. Everyone keeps coming along to them because they sort of make space for people to tell their own stories. And I think it's that kind of really delicate balance between taking an enormous amount of care and setting things up really well and being a control freak editor so that you're not publishing rubbish, you're publishing things which are well argued, well written, so doing that and letting people, just giving people a platform and being totally hands-off. And as a control freak editor, that's quite confronting, but it's so liberating. And I think it's because I've always been interested in that space between intention and accident. I've been interested in that for 20 years. And Parler's another way that happens.
Because it's that openness that allows people to feel welcome, because you can, again, the sort of seeing yourself in a story, where do you not fit and where can you feel there's something that you're not being put in a box? Or, really...
But also I think the fact is people, like if you write for us, we take care with your words. So it's not, so I don't think that the sort of, that side of it is, I think that's as necessary as the totally open platform is. Yeah. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, is it on? Yes. So belonging is such an important word and also a very important topic. So I just wanted to say that when Omaira and I co-founded Taller Creando Sin Encargos, we were both coming back to Puerto Rico after living in Europe and US, teaching and also practicing architecture. And we wanted to teach differently, and we were at a place that we wanted it to be because it's our home, but we didn't have, a grupo, like a group of people that will support these new ways of teaching. And of taking, academia as a collective or horizontal space. And similar way happened with archiving in, when I met Natalia from Buenos Aires coming to Cambridge, and then Hawan, that she was also working with immigrants in the Texas-US border. We wanted to belong, we go to the library, we don't have books that we want to read and use for our, research. And there was Michelle Beldon that I forgot to mention, she's the lead librarian, and she was also trying to look for ways of how to get underrepresented resources in the library, because as you can imagine, their school is full of people from all kinds of places, and when they arrive, they can't speak about their project that is in Cuba, for example, because there's no resources there. So we found ways to create Google Docs, and make it open. And then people started just sending us lists of books that they wanted to, read and use. And that's how, Michelle, that had a budget, because the library had a budget, was able to acquire. And now we're doing the second edition in a month, because Hawan, she's Korean American. So now we're doing an Asian Asian and African American resources, for the library one more time. And we hope that the project continues with other students that feel there is a need to have their voices heard. So thank you.
Something else, just looking at our pictures too, it's like it's the images you choose to show. So when you send out an invitation to an upcoming event, if your images of the people who are at the previous one show a mix of people, not just everyone who looks like you or like, I mean, we're very conscious that we're a group of white middle-aged women. And so we kind of, luckily the whole parlour audience is, it's not that, but I think it's the ways that you extend invitations in subtle ways rather than the ways that you extend invitations in the ways you make space. I should also say that the name parlour was coined by Karen Burns, who's been talked about quite a lot today. So.
Thank you so much for your presentations and of all of your work. I'm very inspired. I wanted to ask for your advice. I belong to an organization called Mujer Arquitecta that is in Spanish is kind of big, but we've been very present online and on the digital world, and seeing your work in the presence and connections and person to person as we started, but then pandemia and everything. And I wanted to ask about how do you choose how to move forward, because we started recording and saving everything, and then you just sit in a pile of a lot of stuff. And sometimes it is a bit overwhelming and you end up doing nothing because it gets a bit too complex, or maybe you just think it becomes this huge weight. So how do you go from recording conversation and transcript, and then you end up kind of giving back the content in a way people can relate and connect? Yes, how do you manage with all the records?
Well, I'll just respond, because I think we're still learning. And I think it's a long process. And so one comment just on that is, again, a little bit about care that you were mentioning, is that, the learning curve, I mean, my other work hasn't included recordings, conversation. We've been learning a lot about, low technology, how to do things with noise reducing wind in Scotland, while people are having a very lovely, quiet conversation and having a bit of a laugh. I mean, actually, it's lovely, you get emotions. One of the things I suppose that comes with that is this relay of permissions. So actually having a conversation about what is being recorded. So actually building protocols that are bespoke. So we're obviously looking at guidance about oral history and ways to do things within a sort of ethical framework. But it comes down to making that bespoke. And Anne, who was in some of those photographs, going backwards and forwards with her and say, what do you think about this transcript? Are you happy to have that in? So again, I think we have to be quite careful about always that check about, is it my record? And I'm very aware actually that in our open source, because it's University of Edinburgh, it actually has my name on it, and I've done the editing. I do like a bit of rigor in there, but it's not my content. It's the legacy of those individuals who've spoken. And the speaking becoming on the record, I think, is a really, really important moment of consent. Of seeing, you don't understand what you've said, and you see it written down, and something goes on that you think, oh, it's out of context. So one of the things we've done in our protocols is we've contextualized. So in each of the transcriptions, we add context, we reference through this transcription, so that there's a way that it can be read in a context. I think there's lots more to be done and to learn, I think, is all I'd say.
I mean, in relation to that sort of overwhelming flood of material that one can generate and then knowing what on earth to do with it, I'm with you. I just think things have their time, right? So we've been running those salons since, I'll tell you, the salons came about because Laurie got in touch and said, let's do Wikipedia. We're like, okay. So we did a Wikipedia event. We had never done an event before. I mean, I'd done events in other jobs, but Parla had never done an event. And all these people came along, and the woman from Wikimedia, who was fantastic, went around the room and said, "Why are you here?" And a whole lot of people said, "We just want to be part of Parla." I was like, oh my God. And they turned out to be useless at editing Wikipedia. But it made me realise that because we had been entirely online, and I thought, okay, we need to start doing some events. And at that same time, I'd had a window manufacturer come up to me and say, "We really like what you do, we'd like to sponsor you." They gave us quite a lot of money. And so we could run these events around Australia, and they were great to work with. So it wasn't, the money didn't feel tainted. It was just like we could, we have nice wine. Again, it's part of hospitality. It's part of, you make people welcome, you have nice food, you have, so we started running those events, and we recorded them, almost all of them, and then they just sat there for a long time, and I lost some of them. And then my colleague Ali came along, and we're like, I've been saying, we're going to turn this into a podcast. I've been saying that for years. We've finally done it. So it took a long time. I mean, I think sometimes it's worth just gathering. So we photograph everything, almost everything. We record almost everything. We don't always put it all out into the world immediately, because that, it's another whole bulk of work. But once, we had a little bit of capacity, and Ali will tell you that I'm the main block, she's kind of going, "Would you just record that intro?" So I think, I know that kind of weight of stuff can be, and of course we had everyone listen, but, two of my absolutely favourite conversations, they just said, "Nope, that was for the moment, you're not putting this into the public realm." Other people say, "Oh, can you edit that? Can you edit this?" And some people go, "I can't listen, but I'm sure it's fine, just do it." So that's really fascinating too.
But I think it's also, I would think about curating in the sense of what are the topics and messages maybe that's timely that you want to cull from your archive to put out there, or what's missing. I think in our case, we have we never thought about documenting pretty much anything except for the exhibitions. So, we have terrible photos, and I think, maybe being more intentional. But I think for us, it's, okay, what is not present that we want to help create a space for that conversation or that work? And it sounds like you've got so much material that you could really so easily cull through that and create, these opportunistic ways to engage. I don't know if it's certain demographics or certain topics, but I think to really, because you also probably don't have all the time in the world. So to be really, and speaking from experience, so how can you be most effective and target what it is your goals are with the public that you want to engage with?
And I just think sometimes things have their time, and you've had something sitting there and it's just the right moment, or something comes along and it's the right, but if you haven't got it sitting there and been thinking about it, then you can't take advantage of that moment. But yeah, don't despair.
Hello? Yes, now you can hear me. Thank you for your inspiring talks and your inspiring projects. Us in women writing architecture, we have the problem that we have a little bit of an echo chamber going on with our audience. So I guess that I wanted to ask, what is your approach? We've been talking about publics, we've been talking about audiences and public engagement and belonging, which I think that is really nice to hear that word mentioned over and over again today. So my question to you is, how do you deal with audiences, and how do you target your work towards whom? And do you feel like you're in an echo chamber or not? Or do you aim to get out of it in some way? Thank you.
That's a great question. And I think we think of ourselves as being outside that echo chamber because we see ourselves as on the margins, like in the way that Bell Hooks that has written about it, so that the margins get to push the center. And I think, and because also we have been so focused on students in the academy, which is just such an amazing space of energy and engagement. And so to create a platform and a space for students' voices to try and push out beyond. So our university hubs, which are a series of brown bag lecture series that students, we work with them, they organize it, we have a theme, but then they invite people. So it's really, and it works to counter the lecture series of institutions, which I'd researched for about 5 years, looking at collecting data. It's mostly, as you would expect, white and male. So we're trying to think outside of and work against that very narrow bandwidth. It's still architecture focused, but I do think the exhibition, both exhibitions are a way to bring design and architecture out to much broader audiences, which we're very invested in doing, to help educate the public about why design matters and why women's contributions to design matter. So I think we've really tried to work to bring those discussions out beyond the discipline, because otherwise it's not going to do much for the discipline if we're only talking to ourselves.
I think I'm just reflecting when you were talking, Justine, about the Instagram takeover, because Nicola, who's our sort of third of the co-team, was one of the takeovers, and that was one of our formal
I think that was the
interactions. I think I knew a lot about the work, and we'd overlap, but in terms of our work together. So I think there's two responses I think I'd like to make. One is that there is a digital dimension to audience, and I think that's been extraordinary and empowering, and it's made all these connections and the visibilities of work going on that might be quite small or quite bespoke, but they actually start to be able to be put in relation. And the sort of courage of just being able to contact people or make a connection, I think, is wonderful for the kind of work we're doing. I think the other response is it's very, very local. I don't feel we're in a massive echo chamber, because we've basically been benefiting from the generosity of existing audiences in, I mentioned Glasgow Women's Library. So that's, the audience for that is very mixed. It's very local to a geographical city. But it's also got connections into the art and cultural sector. So those are where we found we've gone out of architecture, so we're in a broader area. And the Archifringe, which I mentioned, which has been a very, very clear response to a staid, conservative professional institute, is an extraordinary work that's gone on for 7 or 8 years, and has set a model of supportive platform through a sort of annual festival, events, very much less edited than I think we're concerned with. But in the sense that it's expanded practice, but it allows a lot of grassroots world. And that's hungry. And a lot of it crosses over with the student world, as you were talking as well, Yazmin. You know what I mean? The students who are not identifying with that, that trajectory. And so though we've benefited from those two modes of audience, the very digital and the very local.
Our Instagram has been quite amazing. It feels like every host brings people with them, and not that many seem to leave. Whether they look at it is another matter, but that's been quite interesting. People always say to me, "Oh, are men welcome at your events?" I'm like, "Of course they are." But I'm also not desperately trying to make sure every salon has a 50-50 audience. But what we find is the more events we run, they get a reputation for being good events, and people come along. That's the in-person stuff. We have a really big online program now, and those are quite targeted, and we often work with different organisations or different other groups. So, as I said before, there's a huge emphasis in Australia and New Zealand in relation to everybody improving their Indigenous competencies and their cultural competency. And in Australia, that has, in fact, in both countries, that is now part of the formal competencies that frame the regulation of the profession. So everybody has now got to learn some kind of, I mean, if you live in Australia or New Zealand, you should, but a lot of people, Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is, so we run this really wonderful event series which is led by a couple of Indigenous women. They have an organisation called Deadly Germ, and we collaborate with them. And they're just these most extraordinarily kind of wide-ranging, loose conversations. But because it's been legislated that professional architects have to have some kind of experience and knowledge, we now find a whole lot of people coming to those who probably wouldn't come to I mean, I get emails going, where can I get my CPD? I'm like, well, we've got like 18 things and they're really great. But again, some of those people will never come back to us, but some of them will then find us and do all sorts of other things with us too. And, we run, we run these much more kind of, I suppose, events ranged at really quite clear workplace change. So flexible work, part-time work, how to deal with harassment, very different event series. Larger people from larger practices will come to those. So we kind of, I suppose we just try to, I'm not sure how strategic this is, but we've ended up with this quite diverse mix of stuff because we just follow what we're interested in. I mean, we are lucky. We've made this thing that we can kind of chase what we're interested in with. It's, it's a pretty nice thing, really. but people come. And, I
really
guess if people
good to
stop
have
coming, you start worrying. But at the moment, they're coming.
Can't get a word out. No. I was just saying it's a really good question, though, to take back as a sort of sense check, because I think, again, that who is the audience? Do we actually take it for granted? Do we rethink it? Is it still inviting, or have we assumed certain modes that we think work? So I think just keeping active about that. So thank you for.
And what are the goals of impact that you're seeking? Also, I think in terms of the echo chamber, yeah. And I think lunch.
Okay, I'm suffering by the persons who are preparing the lunch. I told them that we were going to be late, probably. Justine, you speak too fast for me. Too fast. I will review the record because I think I have followed you, but too many things you have said. Now we are going to have lunch in the West Terrace. Then at 3:30, probably we will begin the session of books. And at 6 o'clock on time, I want you all here because Dolores Hayden told me that she was going to be 15 minutes earlier. So to see if the connection works and so on. And we will have here a buffet in person, so we will have some kind of conversation. I love chatting, totally. Totally. I will have to. Who doesn't? I love chatting with no goal. Talking by talking, because that's when the best ideas come out. So continue until tomorrow. Okay, thank you.